Hello students. Today we are going to do the next chapter of book Snapshot. Before proceeding, I just want to tell you that this lesson gives us a message about a very rare but unique trait of one's personality, that is loyalty. The theme of the chapter, the address, deals or revolves around the personal challenges that all of us have to encounter as individuals while resolving crises in our own lives. With war comes death, destruction, and a dehumanizing effect on human beings. This story unfolds to its readers the disruption caused in the narrator and her mother's lives due to the war. On a deeper level, it is also a story about memories. Now I'll give you a brief introduction of the lesson. The story is about the human predicament that follows the pre-war and post-war period. Mrs. S, who was a Jew, was a rich lady, whereas Mrs. Darling was a non-Jew. The girl, daughter of Mrs. S, had lost her house and her mother during the war, and now she had decided to come back to take her possessions from Mrs. Darling, an acquaintance whose address was given by her mother years ago. When she reached the house, the woman treated her with a cold reception and didn't let her into the house. She decided to go back anyway, and then she met her mother, who let her in and told her to wait inside. When she saw all the belongings of her mother in front of her, she couldn't connect with them and decided to leave the house. Now we shall know about the creator of the chapter, Marga Minko. Marga Minko was daughter of Sarah Minko, born on 31st March 1920, is a Dutch journalist and writer. Her real surname was Manco, but in an official accidentally switched the first vowel. Let's know about the characters now that are the narrator. Margot Minko is a Jewish girl who faced the pain, sufferings, and losses, including the irreparable loss of her dear mother in war. She is a brave and courageous girl who faces the challenges of a lonely life after the war is over. She is attached to her mother's things, and after returning to her home city, she goes to Mrs. Darling to claim her mother's things back. Mrs. Darling's cold, indifferent, and discouraging behavior further depresses her. She had already suffered many losses, including the irreparable loss of her dear mother. Finally, she decides to leave her mother's things and forget them forever, as the things will evoke her mother's memories more often and make her more miserable. A girl who is completely attached to the belongings of her mother since she lost her mother to a war. Then Mrs. S. The story, the address, Mrs. S is shown to be a simple Jewish woman who became a victim of war. Mrs. S was a good homemaker who took pride in her collection of household things such as crockery, cutlery, etc. Mrs. S was a simple, trustworthy woman who allowed Mrs. Darling to take her things so that they would not be destroyed in the war. She was good by nature and couldn't think of insulting anyone. And then Mrs. Darling, who is a very important character of the chapter. Mrs. Darling was a neighbor long time ago of the narrator of the story. The narrator, a young woman, went to Mrs. Darling's house in Holland to fetch her belongings back from Mrs. Darling's house. She lived in Holland. That was during the 1940s. Mrs. Darling showed her bad character. She was a thief. She used the belongings like clothes, utensils, etc. of the author and author's mother. In spite of promising to take a good care of them, that was very untruthful, dishonest and cheating kind of thing she has done to narrator and her family. Also, she didn't take care of those belongings in a proper way, so she was careless and rude too. She was bad in that she did not even invite the narrator into her house and treat her like a good guest. Now we shall proceed with the detailed explanation of the chapter The Address. Holland was fighting for independence. The narrator had joined the forces. It was a long drawn and deadly war. Success seemed a far cry. The people doubted if any of the soldiers turn alive. The narrator had only her mother, Mrs. S., at home. Her mother was worried about the safety of her belongings. She had a lot of silver cutlery and antiques. One day, an old acquaintance of hers turned up unexpectedly. She was Mrs. Darling. She won the confidence of Mrs. S. and offered to take away Mrs. S.'s precious things to her own home for safekeeping, and Mrs. S. accepted the offer thankfully. The narrator was home for a few days during the first half of the war. She noticed the change in the room. She missed several things. She surprised the mother by her keen observation. She was then that Mrs. S. told her about Mrs. Darling, who had kindly taken away all the table silver vases, antique plates, crockery, etc. Mrs. Darling promised to keep all those nice things safely. Mrs. S., however, didn't get an assurance that those things were returnable. Next morning, Mrs. Darling turned up again. This broad-backed woman was taking away the heavy suitcase stuffed with things. The mother introduced the narrator to Mrs. Darling. It was the first time the girl had met her. Mrs. Darling lived in Marconi Street, house number 46. Remember, students, you have to remember this address, that is Marconi Street, house number 46. Don't misunderstand it with Macaroni Street. It is Marconi Street. The mother told the daughter to remember the address, and she did remember it for a long time. After the War of Liberation had come to an end, the narrator returned to her city. Gradually, everything became more normal again, and one day the narrator was reminded of all her possessions. The mother was no more alive. She was alone, living in a single room. There was no space to recover all those things and keep them in that room. Still, she wanted to see them, but obviously all the things were belonging to narrator's mother, and touch them too. So she travelled by train to Marconi Street and rang the doorbell of the house number 46. A woman opened the door partly. Through the narrow opening, she studied the visitor. She was Mrs. Darling herself. She had not expected the girl to come back home alive. She refused to recognize the visitor. The narrator for a while wondered if she had come to the wrong place, but her doubt was removed when she saw Mrs. Darling wearing her mother's green knitted cardigan. So she had come to the right address. Mrs. Darling couldn't help asking how she alone had survived the war. She refused to let the visitor into the house. She closed the door, and the narrator looked at the nameplate again. It said Darling number 46. She walked back to the station and travelled back the memory lane. Her first visit to Mrs. Darling's house was in vain. It was her first visit, but she didn't accept defeat. She decided to try a second time. This time, Mrs. Darling's 15-year-old daughter opened the door. Mrs. Darling was not at home. The narrator decided to wait. She followed the girl along the passage. She saw her heavy candle holders hung next to a mirror. She was taken to the living room. She found herself in the midst of things which she wanted to see. But she was pained to see them arranged in a tasteless manner. The furniture was ugly and the air was damp smelling. She sat down at a table and noticed that the tablecloth was hers. It had a burn mark to the edge left unrepaired by her mother. The girl said that her mother would be back soon, and she had already made tea for her. The girl offered a cup to the visitor as well. She opened a box and took some spoons out. All those things were a part of the narrator's mother's belongings. She realized that one got so very used to things that one didn't notice them intentionally. Mrs. Darling's daughter also never noticed that the cutlery she used every day was silver. She opened a drawer to bring out more spoons and forks. But the narrator didn't wait to see them. She didn't want to meet Mrs. Darling again. So she jumped up to go to catch her train. At the corner of the road, she looked up at the nameplate. The address was correct, but she didn't want to remember it anymore. She had no intention to visit that house again. She had lost interest in the things that had been taken away from her house and put in strange surroundings. Moreover, she had no need of them in her small rented room. Only a handful of cutlery fitted in the narrow table drawer. So she made up her mind to forget that address forever, and it was quite easy to do now. So student, to sum up the address, I just want to tell you that we learn from the chapter that the intricate emotions of humans like trust, hope, and betrayal, as well as the ill effects of life, of war, from this chapter. Hope you have understood the chapter. Thank